My name's Antonio Donini. I'm a frequent visitor to Berlin. If it's October, it must be Berlin. And so I'm sorry if some of you have to bear with me again. But first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, and I'm always impressed by how this Congress is growing and how it's particularly exciting to be able to interact with young people who are potentially entering this career that some of us have been struggling with for a longer period of time. So our task is to talk about building a movement across sectors. I mean, that's kind of a loaded way of presenting the issue of how various communities of actors interact in the field or in reflecting about what happens in the field. I'm not sure that one movement is the answer, but certainly our panel here will present us three different approaches: a more development approach with Yonas, who is the executive director of Common Vision for Development Association, which is based in Ethiopia, and then Tirana Hassan, who is the crisis response director at Amnesty International, and Rachel Kiddell-Monroe, who is the director of the International Board of MSF. So we have a humanitarian perspective, Dunantist humanitarian perspective, a human rights perspective, and a development perspective. What is missing really is the political, military kind of perspective of what happens in the field. And I'll start with an anecdote which relates to the World Humanitarian Congress. I think it was 2 years ago, the night before the opening of the Congress, the organizers had the brilliant idea to show a movie. And this movie is called The March, and it was made by the BBC in 1991. It's never been shown since. I guess it was too hot to handle, because it's the story about three communities also. It's a story basically of a preacher in somewhere, it could be Sudan, it's the desert, and he starts walking and people start walking with him. And he has a very, very simple message, and his message is, we are poor because you are rich. And so they start walking across the Sahara, and this group grows and grows, and there's thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people. And all of a sudden, the EU sends their development commissioner down to see what's going on, and then the military start being very, very excited about what's happening, and send the EU forces, as if there were any, to protect the borders. And so this movement grows and grows, and I'm not going to tell you how the movie ends, but basically it shows that it's about root causes. It's about humanitarian response, because clearly these people are crossing the desert and need some kind of humanitarian support. And it's about the political and military response. So I think that we are at this juncture, and I think what we want to do during this session is reflect on how these different communities, unfortunately we don't have the military or the politic community here, how these communities interact and what is the prospects for the future, how this interact is going to evolve. So I'll give the floor first to Yonas. I'm not going to introduce you one by one. If there's anything you want to say about who you are and what to do, please say that, but very, very briefly, and we'll continue and then leave time for enough for Q&A.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I would like to pass my sincere thanks for FSM and for MDM, as well for German Red Cross and the Berlin Chamber of Physicians. Had it not been given the opportunity, I will have no chance to be here and to express my views regarding to these topics. Having that, as I have been seen from the profile, I'm Yonas from Ethiopia, and I have done my first degree in Ethiopia, having agricultural background, as well as I have a basic degree in Calais University in management, and then I did my first master's degree in Wageningen University, one of the popular university in the Holland. Back home, then I employed in one of the international NGO, which is Self-Help Development International. Then after I conceived my point of view of having a new vision, so that I am a founder and executive director of Common Vision for Development Association in Ethiopia. It was established in 2005. Here I would like to give you the bird's eye view regarding to what is going on concerning to building movement across the sectors. Those are the humanitarian aid, the development work, and the politicians. And again, comparing with what's actually on the ground. And I will share with the experience we had through developing this Common Vision for Development Association and what we have done so far, passing all these challenges and opportunities. As you see, humanitarian aid and development work and politics are run by different sectors, but they have their own roles. All work is for the betterment of society, but their work relationship is fragile. They don't have a strong relationship, even though they are working together. At the same time, there is a power and resource imbalance. One who has a power has less resources, and vice versa. One who has a power has less resources, and vice versa, for the specific purpose that is to end need. Because of this controversy, the people in need are suffering, and resources are less effectively used, which ultimately affect the needy people. This keeps the world in vicious circle of humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian aid saves life for today, whereas the development work saves life for tomorrow. Politics work for fairness of the system or ideology to bring harmony among citizens. The center of excellency for all sectors is ensuring betterment of human beings in line with their respective different roles. People which do not save today, we will not change their life tomorrow. The life saved today, if do not change tomorrow, we will face a crisis again. The changing life should be managed by a sound system. All parties are equally important to these needy people. Collaboration for the mutual goal will bring efficiency, digital technology, as honey produced by bee. The humanitarian aid without development work makes a needy people practicing free support with no skill transfer, which leads to dependency. Humanitarian aid projects should be complemented or should have a development and risk management component. And also it should have a holistic approach. It should contain the health aspect, the nutrition aspect, the wash, the education, child protection, psychosocial support, awareness raising, etc. is a mandatory to address a basic need. This needs collaboration by all concerned sectors, including active involvement of all local actors. If not, the emergency work will be a recurrent scenario, as we have been seeing currently. Joining work enables to give a remedial solution for the root causes, that is poverty, good governance, and conflict crisis. The needy people are the center and the driving force to determine their needs, thus involving all actors at all levels is not only mandatory, but also the 21st century civilization reality. Denying this reality is abusing our mutual goal. It needs to shape our way to this reality, otherwise it will be a fatal intervention and breadwinning work. Common Vision for Development Association, established in 2005, has implemented 50 projects and reaching more than 150,000 people. It has 5 programs for security, primary health, WASH program, education and emergency and relief program. CVDA development approach and principle. Consider local resource utilization. This includes indigenous knowledge and local expert, skill transfer through training, demonstration, experiential visit, and awareness raising. It begins with a need assessment and resource mapping, value clarification, declaration of roles and responsibility to stakeholders. CVDA sell and buy idea and makes stakeholders to have a common vision. Everybody has to the minimum innate potential what it needs to ignite. Collaboration with a donor, government, and target beneficiary. Address many issues in a single project or holistic approach with a minimum budget. Multi-purpose urban garden project for HIV affected and infected family will a reflection of multiple benefits: improve the balanced diet intake, diversify income, increase social interaction, reducing stigma and discrimination, conserve soil and water. It was adopted by the government of Ethiopia, and job creation, it became a cause for policy development for urban agriculture. Urban garden project at Awasa increases productivity, it reduces water water, labor and labor and other input consumption by 50%, possible to reduce in all season. The beneficiary passes their tankers for who supported to develop the skill to live. This is also a vegetable garden using a growing bank where there is a shortage of places. Okay. We have a different approach and we have a different intervention. These are some of the issues which you need to look. And the other thing is these are the programs we had conducted and the benefit. The first project implemented by CVDA in 2005 is still serving a number of households, life saved and changed sustainably. Start decent life and able to build assets and mitigate hazards. Open their eyes and act on their hand to untap the potential in their hand. Challenges of Ethiopia NGO and CVDA, Proclamation 6621. All civil society fell under open prison by the name of benefit to the target beneficiary. The reality is to stay on power for an indefinite period of time. Among many fortification, one is excessive restriction on human rights advocacy work. Considering a number of NGOs were pushed out, a new one hindered not to engage in the sector. Needy peoples are suffering to exist on our planet, which is our common resource. Next scenario, new leadership came to power through unreserved commitment by all citizens. Revision of Proclamation 621/2009 drafted. Still, the deep-rooted political system causes for the internal displacement of more than 1 million people since June 2018, while the solution is in our hand. These are the next scenario. New leadership came to power through unreserved commitment. Okay, these are the displaced peoples, which you observe more than 1 million people in some regions. So the recommendation is need to look beyond the power and the current generation through a collaboration across the sector. I'm here as a result of collaboration. Thank you for your attention and the opportunity I have given.
Is this working? Thank you, Yonas. Without further ado, Tirana, you want to speak from there? You want to speak up from there? Okay, that's fine.
Great. Sorry, I will just put that there. Hi, my name is Tirana Hassan, and I'm the Director of the Crisis Response Program at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International. I won't sort of go into my bio too much because you've got, I think, a list of all the speakers. Sure. You've got a list of all the speakers, but I come to you with a perspective which is quite unique, and I think it will be reflected in my comments today. I actually came from the humanitarian world. That's how I started. I was in child protection and then more broadly civilian protection. And then I transitioned over to what some people say is the dark side, to a human rights organization. And I was working for Human Rights Watch and now Amnesty International. So my questions and my comments will reflect those two experiences and not just purely the human rights one. So my first question to all of us is, do we really understand what we're talking about when we are referencing a movement? And my guess is no. You know, within MSF, to call yourself a movement, are you referring to the operational sections, the various officers, the volunteers? You know, within Amnesty, we refer to ourselves as a movement of millions of members around the world. We include the International Secretariat, we include the national sections, but we also include that neighbourhood group who meets once a month to write letters for political prisoners, and individuals who get online and sign an urgent action to stop an execution. And we also see ourselves as a movement within a movement. We are part of a wider human rights movement. And then you've got the International Federation for the Red Cross, where you have a movement of sections of national societies around the world. And then there's this other idea of movement, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, these sort of social movements. So depending on who you talk to, in each of these organisations, you'll likely hear a different perspective. And you'll probably hear a different response to whether those organisations are a movement. And if they do think that they're a movement, you'll probably get different organizations, different individuals in each organization, Amnesty included, who will describe the experience of a movement and the purpose of a movement as being somewhat different. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to talk about movements as the sense of collaboration for change around a common goal, or addressing, or movements that come together to address common threats or challenges. So regardless of how we see ourselves, and if we identify as a part of a movement or not, the truth is we have more in common than we think. What we all strive for at the end of the day is human dignity, the preservation of life and human dignity. And whether it's through the provision of humanitarian assistance, whether it is through development aid projects, whether it is through human rights advocacy and documentation, you know, at its core, we strive for something similar. But our challenge is not defining our collective purpose, because I think we have hundreds of things to choose from. You know, access to essential medicines. We would frame that within the human rights world as the right to health and economic, social, cultural rights, humanitarian access and ensuring life-saving assistance. You'd say that's the remit of humanitarian organisations. I'd argue that it's also about the right to life. It's about the Geneva Conventions and its additional protocols. It's about customary international humanitarian law, which is very much the human rights remit. You're talking about protection of hospitals or schools. You know, I say absolutely, that's IHL. I think human shields, targeting of civilians, potential war crimes. Our lenses for analysis may be different, but our commonalities and our concerns are many. And our challenge is that within each of us, for each of us, within our institutional bubbles, we all think we are magical unicorns and there is no one else like us and no one can do what we do and we fart rainbows. That is essentially the operating position from many organisations, and I would say, including my own. And so the idea that we can work collaboratively really challenges that notion that there is no one else like us. But these narratives exist within each organisation, and no one understands our mandates, and you hear that the idea of collaboration will be met with deep scepticism. The idea of collaborating with a human rights organisation, God forbid, that probably means compromising your operational security. Could it mean watering down your principles? But you know, does collaboration with other sectors mean that we're shifting outside our mandate? If any of those sound familiar to you as humanitarian actors in this room, I can guarantee you those are also conversations that happen in the other sectors too, including the human rights sector. So in a more less useful point about our commonalities, we have that one in common too. But we are limited by these fixed narratives about in our circles, which have evolved over time. Sometimes they're based on history, and sometimes they're brought to life simply by just being repeated often enough. But you know, why do we need to think about collaboration now? Well, it's because the current environment we're in. I don't need to talk to you and explain to you about protectionist policies, about the us and them, about the demonization of others and the restriction of fundamental rights, which implements not only anything from freedom of speech, but what's going on in terms of your humanitarian agency's abilities to operate particular operations in particular settings. And you know, it is also playing out, it's trickling down, this sort of this protectionism and this toxicity is trickling down into the areas which we needed, the instruments that we were using in the past to help us resolve issues such as the Security Council or the Human Rights Council. But it might surprise you to know that one of the most effective social organisers or movements worldwide right now are extreme nationalists. It is extreme nationalists who are sharing information on strategies, they are working across borders, they are flooding different channels with in different markets with the same message, and it is working to great effect. There's actually a very interesting academic in Santa Barbara called Hari Khan, and she references this very interesting study by a sociologist called Ziad Munson, and he looked at how did the pro-life movement do so well? And how did that become such a strong and powerful movement? Not just a large movement, but a powerful one. And what was interesting in Munson's study was that, you know, we would assume the people that join the pro-life movement are all people who believe in pro-life, right? But it wasn't the case at all. Actually, most of the people on the front line, they found, were not pro-life, weren't anti-abortion. Actually, they were indifferent on the issue. Some of them were actually pro-life when they joined. They went for a sense of community. And, you know, I'm digressing a little bit, but the point is that it wasn't the principles that brought about change. It was the movement and the community that developed the principles, and that grew in strength. And so my point about movements around purpose and around collaboration, and I have time, is very much that it's powerful and it can change mindsets, and we have to work together, essentially. In the current geopolitical space, it's really not going to cost our organizations much to work together on the things that make us the things that bring us together, on our commonalities. You know, there have been opportunities this year where we have all done incredible work, but I think about what we could have done on the Rohingya crisis or what we could do on Yemen if we were working across, and we could be so much more effective. And we're out there and we're doing it, but we're just not doing it to full efficacy. So I'm going to wrap up here and leave you with one thing that haunts me. I once heard from a UN security diplomat that we're drowning in words. And this doesn't matter if you're a national NGO, you know, if you're just a local activist, if you're a regional body, or if you're an international organization like MSF or Amnesty. If our targets are saying that they're drowning in words, we should heed caution, because we're just making noise, and it's very clear we need to start moving, working in concert.
Last but not least, Rachel.
Hi, how are you all? It's great to be here. It's actually my first time at the Humanitarian Congress, so I was very happy to be invited and to be part of this panel, in particular because my background is I'm an activist. And I've always been an activist. I started my life working with a local NGO, and I believe in the power of people to bring change. And I just want to remind people, we talk about MSF now as this huge organization, but when it started, it was just a bunch of people who came together because they wanted to make change. And I think we, as we grow and we move on in our organizations, we have to keep remembering what that first fiber was that brought us together. I've just come from London. I live in Montreal, but I was just in London for a couple of days, and I was in the theatre. And I went to see a play, and the play was called The Jungle. I don't know if anyone here has seen that play. Has anyone seen it? You should. It's a play that's put on about the realities of what happened in the jungle in Calais. If you remember, this was a camp that was in the north of France, of people who were prevented from going into the UK. And I visited that camp in 2015 and was absolutely horrified by what I saw. The amazing thing about seeing this play just before coming to this Congress was it really highlighted the three key points that I wanted to bring up today with you on why we need to build movements across sectors and maybe also how we can do that. The first thing that play highlighted was the importance of humanity and solidarity in our communities. And when I hear Tirana talking about the rise of the right, I always think about how we need to actually change that narrative. And what is that narrative we need to have? It's that narrative of humanity and solidarity. And I think Degan Ali brought it up many times this morning. People forced to flee have shown us that humanitarianism is not something that just happens in far-off places. It's not something that stops when we switch off our television sets or when we press the donate button. What these people who've been forced to flee climate change, violence, conflict, wars, is that we're all connected. We're all in this together. But what is happening to us today is that we're being fed this politics of fear, and that politics of fear is telling us that when we help these people, we become human traffickers or we become smugglers. And politics of fear is really making our societies react in absolutely shocking ways. What happened in Calais, I saw unaccompanied children wading around in mud up to their knees. I saw people who were going back and walking through human waste to get to a small camping tent that was soaked in the rain. I saw how the local community in Calais turned their backs on them, and the security forces aggressed them and maltreated them and eventually just bulldozed them away. In Mexico, we see similar things happening. People fleeing from violence in Mexico, in El Salvador and Honduras, are arriving in Mexico expecting to have some kind of sanctuary. And actually what happens is they meet a second wave of violence, a violence so profound that women, before they flee, take contraception because they know that rape is the price of the journey. They call themselves human cash machines. There are Congolese women sitting in Moria camp today in Lesbos, and this evening someone is going to speak about that as the worst camp in the world. They sit in that camp in 30 degrees heat in tiny camping tents. The UN has left them there, Europe has left them there to sit by the side of toilet banks, too scared to go there because they hear the noises of rape in the night. This is the reality of what we're seeing. It is a crisis, but it's not a migration crisis, it's a human crisis. A human crisis that's got two very clear faces. One is the face of the people that are rejected, and one is the face of the rejecter, the people who are rejecting. So the second point that the play highlighted really clearly and really starkly is that we need to empower communities, we need to empower people and movements. Some of the actors in that play themselves had been in Calais. That was a reflection that came through many times, is that they wouldn't have been here if there hadn't been people helping to get them over there. And big organizations like MSF, which I've been with for 25 years and I love dearly, it feels like a part of me, we've been deeply challenged by this crisis. And in Calais, it was actually the outrage of individuals that made the difference. I've got two acquaintances of mine in the UK who phoned me and said, Rachel, we can't stand to see anymore what's happening in these camps. Where's MSF? Where's the UN? Where's the big organization? Where's Save the Children? And they said, is there something we can do? Should we do something? I said, yes, please do something. Just do something. So what they did was they rented a truck. They bought some mattresses, sleeping bags, and they drove to Calais, a housewife and a young woman. And today, 3 years on, they've created one of the largest organizations in the UK to help refugees. And actually, they were behind this theatre play in the West End last night, which is such an incredible way to get people to know what's going on. We're seeing humanitarian front lines change. And while our large humanitarian organizations have found it difficult to act or have simply been slow, or reticent or unwilling, civil society has been stepping into the breach. And they are mobilizing in the face of nationalist and populist movements. We mustn't think that no one is doing anything. There's a lot of people who are doing a lot of things and are taking action. And when we give the place to those movements and we give them some resources and input and solidarity, they can do amazing things. In 2001, MSF supported South Africans to push back against pharmaceutical companies who were basically trying to stop access to HIV medicines. It wasn't MSF in the front, it was South African people. Similar things are happening today, whether it's in Brazil, in Malaysia, in India, talking about hepatitis C and tuberculosis. There are former US MSFers working in the UK and part of a Take Action group, and one of them is here, which are actually also changing and talking about the rights of migrants, using their experiences. In Turin, it's Italian doctors who are standing at the front line of trying to make sure that migrants are able to access healthcare. But there are real stark differences in our realms of humanitarian action. And I think that really goes back to what Deegan Ali talked about this morning in the shrinking humanitarian space that we have in places like Central African Republic, in Syria, in Sudan, in Somalia. And can we really talk about collaborations when local people are in such crisis and in such anguish? Well, I think that question is past. I don't think we have the luxury of asking that question anymore. Now we have to find ways to think out of the box, to do things differently, to envisage the way that we give humanitarian assistance in a completely different way. And we start to make sure that when we talk about this, we're not just saying, oh, local people are going to become so resilient and they're going to become so impactful. It's not about natural resilience. This is about giving the tools, the resources, and the power to people in those communities. And we can learn from the people who are forced to flee. We can learn from them because they're here living with us amongst our communities. I've got one more point left, Antonia, and then I'll finish. The third point that this play brought out for me was that people who are forced to flee, people in these situations have a powerful voice of their own. They stood on that stage in the London West End and made their voices heard. They're doing that all around the world. And when we talk about dignity, it's about giving people their voice firsthand. Before I finish, I can't go without mentioning the Aquarius, the boat, which now just landed, I think, about an hour and a half ago in Marseille. The risk now is that that could have been the last humanitarian boat involved in search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. This has come as a culmination of pressure, political pressure, right-wing pressure being pushed on those boats. Not only the criminalization of the boats, the criminalization of the people on them, but the criminalization of the aid sector in general. This is the politics of fear that's suffocating us. So what are we going to do to push back on that? And the last words was one of the Syrian actors in this play who said at the end, when he was talking about solidarity, he said, you know, now no one talks to me or greets me in Leicester where I now live. I speak less English here in England than I did when I was living in the jungle. But when I return one day to my city of Aleppo, you will always be welcome, most welcome. I wish we could say the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm not going to try to analyze what's been just said. I think there is one common theme that comes across, which is the preservation of life and human dignity. I think that, you know, whether you're working for a small organization based in Ethiopia, or you have a global kind of remit looking at the erosion of asylum, or the way in which wars are currently run and the inhumanity in wars, I think there's a common thread there. The other common thread is this issue around mobilization or not, and how the other side seems to be much better in mobilizing than people who are trying to protect human dignity are mobilizing. I think one of the troubling things, particularly in Europe, is how the discourse has been captured by the people who are propounding populist, sovereignty-based, if not xenophobic, discourses, and our collective inability to react to that. I think you mentioned the Calais. I think for me, what happened in 2015 is very indicative of, on the one hand, the enormous explosion of spontaneous support for the people crossing the Mediterranean to Lesbos, drowning, or trying to go through the Balkans. And you know, you had what are now called SUVs, spontaneous unaffiliated volunteers, cropping up everywhere. You know, a number of friends of mine, my wife, went to Lesbos and spent weeks there, you know, and filling the gap that apart from MSF, the organized humanitarian system was absent. It was AWOL. It was not there. So on the one hand, there is this capacity to mobilize, but on the other, there is not the capacity to sustain this mobilization and to counter the dominant discourse that both Rachel and Tirana were talking about. So maybe I should stop here and ask the panel if they have any reactions at this stage before we open up to to our friends online and to the audience.
Yep, I can. Thank you. Thank you, fellow panelists. There was one thing that you said, Rachel, which resonated with me, and it's something that comes up a lot, and it's this idea of how much space do we give to the other side. So, you know, the extremist views, etc. Are we giving them too much airtime? And one of the issues, I think, is that we're doing it because they are so organized, and we are constantly reacting to them. And I think our challenge now is that across sectors, whether it be human rights, whether it be humanitarian, whether it be the policy people, we now need to be as organized so that we are setting the tone and we are setting the pace and we are changing the narrative and the discussion.
Okay, thank you. To my perspective, what I would like to say is that we should look at the type of approach we have been currently using comparing with the oldest one. Even though there is a change of technology, still we are using the same approach as we did before, 10 years back or 20 years back. We didn't go with the recent technology and with the demand of the society as well, with the awareness of the society. If we do not consider the changes with the humanitarian aid, with the development approach, if we are on the same position rather than changing with the recent situation, it will have a backfire through time. So that this is one of the issues which need attention.
I think the other thing that I forgot to mention is the extent to which the crisis of multilateralism, the failure of our institutions, is affecting how we go about our business as humanitarians or as human rights activists. I think that you know, Trump may be an epiphenomenon, but the decline of the relevance of the UN is probably a much longer term phenomenon. And whether you know, groups, movements should invest in trying to shore up multilateralism, I'm not sure that's the best use of our time and energy. But it's clear that the Security Council has stopped functioning. It's blocked by its cross vetoes. Many member states in the General Assembly are furious because they say they don't have a role anymore. And at the same time, the closer to our work, if you look at what's happening in Europe, you know, the international organizations, UNHCR, IOM, are constrained by where the money is coming from. Why was UNHCR absent from Lesbos and from the Balkans for many, many weeks and months? Because their donors weren't prepared to accept that, you know, we deal with problems over there. We don't deal with problems here. And I think that false lens that we are using, and that UNHCR and IOM to some extent have been, and many of the NGOs who are funded by European donors, for example, found themselves in a difficult situation because, you know, they didn't want to rock the boat too much for, and this doesn't include Amnesty and MSF, of course, because you have a different kind of business model, which is something that perhaps is also part of the problem, whether the dominant business model of the humanitarian enterprise or of social movements today is one that is able to capture enough of the outrage and resentment and you know, vis-a-vis the abomination of what's happening in places like Yemen or Syria. But I shouldn't be, I'm the chair, I shouldn't be talking. So let me open to the floor, and also to, if there are any questions online from people watching us. So please don't make long, boring statements, but ask questions to the panel. I see a question here. The light is very bad, so I can't see who you are. And one here. So let's take these two first. Oh, and Tamam, I recognize you.
Hello, Florian Westphal, MSF Germany. Thanks very much for the stimulating contributions. I think one of the differences, obviously, between far-right extremist movements and the kind of movement we're talking about here is that the far-right literally just needs to attack, denounce, condemn, and never reason and build and argue and convince in many ways. So, bearing that in mind, my question is a little bit also really to the three of you. I mean, let's take the welfare and the rights of refugees as an example. What does it need, what does it require from an organization such as MSF to really contribute to building a genuinely global movement on this topic? Because understandably, we've talked about this a lot in Europe, but how do we make that global?
Okay, question here.
Hi, my name's Patricia. I'm a medical doctor from Austria. I'm kind of onto what he was just asking. I was just wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit on the more concrete ways on how we could go about that and what your respective organizations, what steps they've been taking, and maybe working on building that united front and collaborating better, and just a bit more specific in how we could improve on that. Thank you.
Okay. Taman, and then we'll ask the panel to react.
Thank you. Tamam Al-Awdat from MSF. My first question is to Rachel, and thank you for the speech, and I think you're absolutely right in invoking empathy. However, it feels more difficult to rely on empathy as a naturally occurring and consistent and sustained phenomena, because we are failing to empathize as people who are affected are further from us, different from us, and don't suffer the same consequences. How should we deal with this phenomena when our call for natural existing empathy isn't producing a movement in people we are targeting in our home societies? The second question is to Tirana, and we seem to have a weird allergy to each other in the human rights, humanitarian development sector. And it's astonishing in every aspect. And I just want to ask you, how do you think this can be overcome? Because, and I'll give example to tell you what I mean by it. We talk about termination of pregnancy, about providing the ability for women to seek abortion. In MSF, we insist every day on saying that we only do that because unsafe abortion is unhealthy and costs lives, which is absolutely true. But part of me wants to say it's because the women's autonomy and their choice should matter as much as the fact that they might die. We don't say that because that's the human rights guy's job. How do we overcome that, weird allergic reaction to each other? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to go first? Rachel?
Yeah, I can start on something. First of all, on how to build a local movement. There are a lot of local movements being built, and I guess they're the ones who would be best placed to answer this. I think that what I was trying to say is that we need to create the space for them. I think that at the moment, the large humanitarian organizations suck up a lot of the space. So, when you see something happening, what's the first thing you do is you go and see, well, what's MSF doing about it? What's Oxfam doing about it? What's MDM doing about it? And we don't get the access to what the local NGOs, how easy is it for us to donate to a local grassroots organization or to a movement or to a collaboration? So some of these things we really need to completely change the way that the system actually works and how we work on that. I think that big organizations can start to think about ways to finance and provide the space for these smaller organizations to work. Is that something we're willing to do? It's a big question. If a donor is giving to MSF and then MSF gives it to a local organization, what does that mean for the donor? So these are some very big existential questions, but I think that we really have to think about these things in a very different way. And I also want to say it's not like we've never done these things before. We're talking a bit today as if this is brand new, but in my time working in this area, I've been involved in a lot of setting up of different organizations. DNDI was formed out of MSF. We also had Health Action International that was formed out of MSF at one point. We created a Rwandan Rights After the Genocide organization. We created legal bureaus. We do lots and lots of things like that, but a lot of this is behind the scenes. So I don't want people going away thinking that this doesn't happen, because it does, because we see the realities and we are supporting. MSF has a huge association, and the Take Action group in the UK is based out of association members. And at the moment we have something called an Urban Spaces project, which is really trying to look at how our association members, when they're in cities, how they can actually work on some of these big issues. And migration is a little bit the cross-cutting theme for that. And thank you, Tamam, for your question about empathy. I agree with you and disagree with you. I think that there has been a lot of empathy for issues as long as they remain far away. And I think what the migration issue has shown us is that when that touches us at home in our nice, wealthy, easy environments, our empathy turns off. And that's the problem that we've got to deal with. What we've seen as MSF, and what we see in Europe, for instance, with this criminalization of aid organizations, is because very much we started working with people who are involved in migration here in Europe, and then we were labeled as criminals and so on. While we were working on Ebola in West Africa, that was fine, and we're going to support that. But when it started to come here, it's like then it became a big emergency. So we have to really start to think about how that's happening. I think changing the narrative is absolutely critical, and I think the word migrant is a huge mistake, because we're going into that narrative of these people who are coming here because they want to steal our jobs, they want money, they're coming here for all of that. It's nothing to do with that. It's people are fleeing for their lives. So talking about forcibly displaced, people who flee, people on the move, I think we have to really change that narrative. And the empathy is there. It's just hidden behind the right-wing rhetoric.
Couldn't agree more. And the BBC has chosen to talk about migrants rather than asylum seekers or refugees. And even if you're an economic migrant and you're drowning in the Mediterranean, you need to be saved. But yeah, Tirana or Yonas.
Okay, thank you again. In the case of building local movement, what I feel is that giving the opportunity for the local community, because they are the one who knows what they need, what they demand, what they lose, what they are looking for. Sometimes when we supply for them something which we don't like, or which they have, that might be a loss for both of the suppliers as well as for the receiver. So that the best thing is that to give an opportunity for the local community, because I feel that everybody has his own innate potential. So what we expect is to ignite that potential, to enhance that potential. If that is the case, it will be possible using the technology, using the opportunity we have, to make a local movement as well. On the other side, the third question was raised about being allergic one another. I think this is a human nature. Having a different ideas, natural, but what it needs is to have a discussion, to have sharing experience, to have an argument, as well as to share experience. If we are sharing experience each other, we'll be able to convince one another. Because the way I am looking is depending upon my experience, depending upon my observation. The way FSM is looking is because of their experiences, so that if we are sharing experience among the leaders, so that the leaders will lead the followers. So in that way, we'll be governed by the winner idea. And if our center is the community, rather than our center is our personal interest or the interest of institutions, beyond the interest of power, beyond the interest of institutions, if our interest is the local community or the needy peoples, that will be solved through time. So that it needs argument, discussion, experiential training, and capacity building. Thank you.
Great. So I'll start with the first question about how do we potentially build this sort of global refugee movement. And I don't think that there's a simple question, but I think that there are things that we can do in all of our sectors and organisations which can contribute. And I think that one of the dangers, and I think it's particularly it comes across a bit more, and we need to be wary of it, about talking about the refugee crisis as something that happened in Europe. I know that we're in Berlin, and so it's very relevant to Germany, but it's not. It's not a European problem. Most refugees are in the neighbouring countries, around the countries which are affected by conflict and crisis. And so whilst that it's not a sliding scale of importance, it's a really important framing of the narratives, and I think that all of us have a responsibility in that, because if we only talk about the refugee crisis as being they're coming to Europe, we are feeding the nationalist agenda. We are feeding the radical perspectives which we are trying to change. But very concrete things that we can do. I mean, we can change things on a policy level. We can change things by using our voice to change opinions amongst communities. We can, it doesn't matter if you're MSF and you say, it's not about neutrality. MSF has advocates, and all of you, I would say, as the humanitarian organizations that I know that are here, local organisations that I work with at the Human Rights Council, we all advocate. We all try to influence governments on different issues, and if we did that together about things like global responsibility sharing, meaning all of the countries around the world start to do what they're meant to do and take a fair portion of refugees and assist instead of the burden coming on to Germany in this instance, or being on Lebanon, etc., then that's something very constructive we can do. And doing what we're already doing, but doing it in a better, stronger, more coordinated way about advocating for safe and legal routes. All of this is very concrete types of action that we could take, messages that we're all actually doing in our individual capacities, which would bring us much closer to potential solutions. And I think there is something in there from all of our experience to reflect on the different points that we interact with the refugee journey and the refugee experience, to actually look at what is wrong with the system. What is it that we should be talking to UNHCR? How should we be engaging at a higher level to be talking really about the relevance of refugee protection? And then I think that I think that answers part of the second question too. The potential is enormous about what we can do. We can share, we can strategize, but on top of that, I think that collaborating across sectors, and this builds on your point, Yonas, it means that we can tap into different things. And for me, I see the potential for the use of technology. To use remote sensing data. All of us spend thousands of dollars, I would say many of us in this room, working for large humanitarian organizations or human rights organizations, will spend thousands of dollars purchasing satellite imagery and analyzing it. And you have to, because you have different purposes, but we're not even resource sharing particularly well on very basic stuff. But remote sensing technology, the fact that some of us have capacity to do in places where you want to do an explo, let's say, and you can't get there, and that it's difficult to get there. The amount that can be done through open source investigations and video verification, through other channels that are not within our traditional realm, the opportunities are immense. And we aren't working, and we lose out by not speaking across sectors. We're missing out on that sort of information and skill set. And Tamam, one point on the empathy thing, there's actually evidence to show that the way that we're going about trying to engage people on empathy triggers a neurological reaction, which is fear-based. We say, this is terrible. It's all terrible. And you need to do something about it. And if you don't care, you're a heartless so-and-so. And in a polarized world where we are very us and them, what does that do? Apparently, it triggers a reaction in the brain which is fear-based. And what do you do when you're scared? You withdraw to what you know. So if we are combating division And if we are combating, exclusion, we're doing the wrong thing by messaging that way. I work in the doom and gloom business, so it's very difficult, but I'm being challenged by my peers to understand the neuroscience and think about that as we move forward. And how do we work together? We could just hug it out. It'll be okay. The reality is, I think we do work together. The thing is that it is shrouded in secrecy. And I think that these are institutional and cultural differences rather than substantive differences. The idea of working with each other does not challenge. I mean, we need to actually be confident enough to know that we will not sway from our mandates. We're not trying to compromise each other's principles. It's about looking for the commonalities and looking where we can strengthen. But the reality is we are doing it, but it's always in secret. The amount of times that an MSF person sees me in a bar in Juba and will run the other way, but then call a little while later is quite common. But they don't want to be seen in public with somebody from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. And that's just unfortunate, and we're just not serving each other particularly well.
Good point. Nora, are there any questions from? No. Okay, so questions from the floor. And we should try to maintain a gender balance. So we need questions from, no, wrong gender. No, sorry, go ahead, go ahead. We'll keep the balance going. Here. Sorry, the light is in my face, so.
Hi, my name is Carla. I work in MSF Spain at the fundraising team. So my question is, from time to time, there's lots of donors who are regular people like us with humble works that decided to give part of their salary to us. And when there's a big crisis, they just ask, I receive lots of emails from different organizations. All of us are doing the same. Why you don't work together? And it's true that on the field, we might work together or not, but the perception is that it's just this humanitarian circus, millions of people there working and doing their own programs, working for their own agenda. And the perception from the donors is that why I have to give to that organization, not to the other. So what we have to do to ensure that the donors know that we are more or less working together, that we can do better, but that we are just not ignoring us there.
Okay, shall we take another couple of questions? Yes, over there in the corner.
Hi, I had a question which was about...
Introduce yourself, please.
My name's Emma Beals. I'm a researcher and journalist. And I guess my question was, you talked about some other sort of groups, maybe with more problematic views, have an easier time of creating movements around their thoughts. And I just wondered if you had a view on the extent to which action matches messaging that allows those groups to have greater traction than perhaps the movement that we're all sort of more interested in, which is to say that, racists talk about racism and then they're racist. Like, they do what they say they will do. They go and beat up some people and they try and stop the boats going, and they actually are very clear on what it is they're trying to achieve, and they do it. Similarly, we've seen Trump has gone and done a lot of the things that he said he would do that we hoped he perhaps wouldn't. And particularly when you're talking about the multilateral system, as you had spoken about earlier, that doesn't necessarily match the rhetoric. So we talk about international law, but it isn't being obeyed, and we're not doing anything about it. We talk about human rights, but people are being stopped from coming on the boats, and we're not doing anything about it. So I guess I was just sort of wondering if there's a way that you guys, that the speakers think that gap can be closed, or if that gap is even a problem, or if that is perhaps undermining the ability to create a movement of people who are interested in the foundational principles that we're all talking about.
So is that about the gap between rhetoric and reality, or is how you construct the narratives around problematical issues.
About the gap. If you're trying to create a movement based on principles, but you're not necessarily living up to the principles you say that you are pushing, how do you close that gap, and does that gap even matter?
Who wants to take a stab at that? Or shall we take another question so we forget about this one? You want to try?
I'll take a stab, just wave if I'm completely off track. So first of all, I think that one of the things that they're saying, particularly if they look at the pro-life movement and the strength of it, was that people didn't go to the pro-life movement because they were anti-abortion. It wasn't principled. And they talk about the fact that people went because they were new to a community, or they were a mother who had, had just given birth and was at home for extended periods of time, and so she went to a church, or they went to their church, and within that church they found this community. Within that community, they found a set of principles, and then they brought into the set of principles. And so the issue is twofold. It shows one thing, which is the power of the movement is that people don't necessarily always join for a movement. They join because they want to do something, and I think that's something that you can harness. People know the difference between right and wrong. How many people have sat at home, it's maybe less of an experience for those working in this sector, have sat at home and just watched something and gone, we have to do something, I have to do something. And they look and they seek to find that space. So it's not always driven by principle. What we don't do well enough is articulate the change that we want to see. What we tend to do is we articulate the problem, and that brings us back to that first point about what that invokes in the human mind, and it doesn't necessarily get us the reaction from people that we want. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Rachel, or?
Yeah, I want to pick up on the point about the change agenda, because I think at the end of the day, I mean, when you talk about the situation of competition between organizations, funders, well, why should I fund MSF and not Oxfam, or why should I fund ICRC and not Médecins du Monde? I mean, this for me is symptomatic of the situation where we've got ourselves into this kind of competitive, challenging way where we now have to distinguish ourselves as being better than the other. And that's not a place that I want to be, because I rather see when we're talking about this is that, humanitarianism is like a huge jigsaw puzzle, and there's lots of different actors and people who need to have a place to play a role in there. No one owns humanitarianism. MSF doesn't own humanitarianism, whether it's classic, traditional, all this discussion about it. This is about being human. So if we go back to this idea that humanity and solidarity are really the center of it, and the impartiality of the humanitarian act is really the key, that takes us back a bit to the discussion we started the day with around neutrality, and is this really a principle? Is this a principle that divides us somehow? I actually don't think of neutrality as a principle. I actually think neutrality is just simply a tool that we use. It's one way that we use to try to be able to bring assistance, to try to be impartial. And when we really can identify what are those common principles, humanity, impartiality, and humanitarian assistance, then we open the whole thing up. And we're all actors playing a different role and fulfilling different functions. So those common principles for me are key. And we also need to think about, when we see where we are now, and we say that, we can't go on like this, well, what is the change agenda, going to Tirana's point? How do we change? I feel like the big humanitarian organizations are tip of this massive iceberg, and how do we turn that iceberg upside down and really reveal everything that's actually going on underneath, unseen, shrouded, and hidden away? In MSF, we just issued a call for change agenda from the International Board to the movement to start to really look at how are we as an organization going to transform in order to face the challenges that are coming up to us in the future. And I think this is something that all organizations should be doing urgently.
Do I see any hands?
Question.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I would like to reflect on the second question. I mean, in the first one, why we don't work together? To my perspective, what's most matter is our efficiency rather than working together. If we are efficient enough, even though we have our own agenda, or if we are working within a given principle, working alone or working independently may bring, if it brings efficiency and if there is no resource duplication, that doesn't affect more. But as institutions, different institutions have their own strategy to manage different issues. So that is the reason why the institutions are working differently. But they should have a common principle globally or nationally. That is the very important part. And through time, hopefully, they may have an opportunity to work together because of the change of life and the changes of the situations, and the technology itself will support them to work together. In the previous time, it was not easy to work together because of different infrastructures. Now it's time to be together and to bring efficiency and to have a better input for the needy community.
There's a question here, one here on the extreme left, or my left. Okay, why don't you start, you, because you're closer to the mic.
Hi, I'm Justin Lyle. I work for People in Need. I think the starting point of Tirana's discussion was important, distinguishing between different levels of movement, because that's actually very unclear. And certainly, like, part of the discussion has been dedicated to this kind of high-level concerted advocacy. And then another part of the discussion is kind of the communities and the people and how we engage people. And you mentioned the far right, and they seem to be better at it. And we've explored some of the implications for organizations, the need to change. But I was wondering, does it mean that the way that our organizations work with the domestic population needs to change fundamentally? It seems like a lot of it is sort of insider, outsider, what are you doing? Like the question about the fundraising. So yeah, do organizations need to become more like social spaces in which people feel community and want to engage? And are there tricks from the far right, practical things that they do, which we should be using beyond the discourse aspect?
Okay. Excuse me. Are there any other questions?
Hi, I'm Chatu Yapa from MSF Australia. I really like, Rachel, how you said that humanitarian action is like, here, it's like building a jigsaw, and there's enough work for us each to have a role in building that jigsaw. And working collaboratively across sectors requires coordination and leadership. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about the current coordination and leadership mechanisms in place, and who actually is in charge of building this big jigsaw?
And is there one jigsaw or several? Or if you try to mix the pieces together, maybe you will not get a picture that makes sense. Who wants to go first? Rachel, you were challenged on the jigsaw.
I was challenged on my jigsaw. I love jigsaws. Who builds the jigsaw? I don't think there's any one place. I mean, I think all of us have worked in the field and railed against coordination mechanisms that try to make us all come into line and come to this meeting every Monday morning at 9 a.m. and you will receive, you know, the same information, and then you will all coordinate together to bring this thing. We rail against that, and there's a reason why we rail against that, because I think that in the differences is where we actually have the biggest impact. If we're all doing the same thing, you know, it becomes unnecessary. So coordination has to be done with a very light hand. It has to be done in a very specific way that allows those differences to come through. I would not like to see a UN agency suddenly say, right, we are going to coordinate all the local, you know, all the different ways of working to coordinate the creation of this jigsaw puzzle. And I think that is a bit the reaction against the localization debate, is this sense that somehow you construct it. I think it constructs itself. And I think when we're talking about providing space, we're actually saying, let people come in, let's see what is coming up, allow the space for those to create. So I don't think I really see a coordination of it happening. I think it's an openness to it happening. And I think it goes again to a bit the idea of the power politics, the centers of power inside humanitarianism that need to be broken down. So I would see it a little bit more that way. And I think a lot of that is starting to already happen. Whether it's one or many jigsaws, well, that's a good question.
But there is, now I'm overstepping my role as chair, but there is a problem about the structure of the system, which is based until now, the dominant system is based on this kind of triad of national government donors, the UN, and NGOs. Some, like MSF, can choose to remove themselves from this triad to some extent. Although in the field, de facto, MSF, they go to coordination meetings and say, I'm an observer, but they're actually there and they participate in the coordination. So, I think for me, one of the issues is this triad going to continue in the future, or are we seeing challenges to this dominant model that maybe are good in the sense that they leave more space for local initiatives, quite apart from the localization debate? There's a wealth of stuff going on in the field that has little to do with the formal humanitarian system. Or do we see that this kind of quite rigid UN system, coordination system, is going to be there for the foreseeable future? And should we be thinking of letting 100 flowers bloom, or should we be thinking of close your eyes and dream about a more unified humanitarian response system?
I'm all for the blooming. That's the short answer. I wanted to make one point that goes to both of these questions, and that is that it's about collaboration across sectors for a purpose. And so, when we talk about jigsaws, it is many, many jigsaws, because you're not going to have who you choose to collaborate with, or who we need to collaborate with, will be very much defined by what the problem is, and who the best people to have around the table are, and who the most important voices are, and what spaces we need to create for people who wouldn't usually make it to the table. So I think that kind of goes to the two things. But when it comes to coordination, some of the most powerful issues around coordination came from the fact that we got together and collaborated over an important thing. It's like human rights. People got together after horrific wars and said, we need to have a set of principles, and IHL. And it was like the ICC, when the Rome Statute developed, when people thought there needs to be a court that's going to deal with this, across the sector, people came together. It wasn't just human rights people and lawyers. MSF also advocated for the creation of the ICC. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if there are crash people in here who have a different view. But, there are important things in the world that we need to change, developments that we believe we need to see based on our experiences, and that is what's going to drive what our collaboration will look like and who's going to be at the table. And that is actually very similar to what I was going to say about, should we change the way we're doing things on the domestic level? What's the purpose of the collaboration? What do we want to change? So if we're talking about, trying to make Europe more inclusive, if we're trying to think about making it safer for refugees in Germany, let's say, I think that yes, we can do things differently domestically. The domestic audience is the important audience, and you need to go out and engage the right people to be part of that collaboration. But if you actually look at what's happening, the idea of community sponsorship and how community groups have developed, I mean, that is important. They are amazing. I'm not sure if people know what I mean by this, but in certain countries, there is community sponsorship initiatives. So you as an individual, Canada does this, and I believe Ireland's about to. As an individual, you can get together a group of people in your community and raise enough money to basically say, we will be responsible for this refugee family to come. I mean, that is collaboration. That's important collaboration. There are ways that humanitarian organizations could potentially, I'm just throwing it out there, be involved in such initiatives. It's certainly something that we as Amnesty are trying to encourage. It's how we believe that's the benefit of the movement. You know, all of these people who used to sit in their groups and write letters to political prisoners, you know, there are opportunities now for them to evolve into taking the challenges to the next level. And in terms of what are the lessons from the far right, I mean, let me say one thing. I'm not saying that you know, the extremist view is doing so much better than us. They're just really effective. And on my colleague, Thomas Coombs, who I talk a lot about this with, he was telling me that right now around Kavanaugh, and the issue of the Supreme Court judge who's up for nomination, they are all meeting daily and getting their messages right across the world and getting it out through their networks. And so they're doing what we aspire to do on the Kavanaugh issue. Like if we could do that on, you know, preventing hospitals being bombed, or if we could do that on access to essential medicines, if we can do that on our issues, if we can unite in with the same level of efficacy around particular issues that we all deem are important, then they're the sort of lessons we should possibly be drawing from them, not a fact that they're doing so much better than us. That's not necessarily the case.
We're rapidly running out of time, so if there are no a very, very brief question, one sentence, go for it.
Hello, my name is Wiltrud. I'm on the MSF Germany, and I've got a question for Tirana. You said it is important, and everyone agreed to work together and to have a kind of common approach. But usually it takes a lead to kind of do that. So on the refugee side, on the global phase, with less UN kind of competency, so whom do you see that, you know, who's going to take the lead and, you know, get everyone together and say, you know, we are doing this advocacy together? Whom do you see in the position to lead this exercise?
Okay. I'm going to give the panel an opportunity to say their last parting thought. And Tirana, you can answer that question after you go third. So Rachel.
You just dropped that one on me.
No, I dropped it on Tirana.
I'm just joking. I think at the end of the day, going back to the jigsaw, lots of organizations with different goals, actually, with different purposes. And I think that we shouldn't try to make it a big melting pot. That's why I always react to this word coordination and common purposes. I think there is something common. There are some common principles that we have between us, but our beauty lies in our diversity. And that is what enables us. The diversity that's missing in the humanitarian structure at the moment is the diversity of the people who are actually living through some of the crises. So I think that that's what we need to bring in. I wouldn't like us to become a soup. I think we need to change the model. I think that there are lots of moves that are going on in different organizations to start understanding how this context that we're in and what this migration has created is really a tipping point in humanitarianism. We'll never look the same again. There's been many in this story, but this is another one. It's a major moment, and I think it really opens up the possibility to do things in a different way that's more effective. And this is in a context of reducing access, shrinking humanitarian space, extremely complex movements and political trends that are going on in the world. At the end of the day, our role as MSF is to make sure that we can help people living in crisis and that we can bring the medical assistance that we need to bring them. And there are certain things, therefore, that we won't be able to do, because if we do those things, we won't be able to reach those people anymore. So we can't do everything. We will not become a generalized actor that will deal with all all different sides. We will try to deal and to promote things that we believe will support our end goal. And I think that that is actually a very important sort of aspect to go on. You know, as Nelka mentioned this morning, 90% of our staff of 45,000 people is working and living in the countries where the crises are going on. That is not a small link into the societies and the movements.
We're running out of time. Yonas,
okay, thank you.
Very briefly.
Yeah, as we see that migration and internal dependence are increasing from year to year, while as well as the humanitarian aid also increasing from time to time. But developmental work still remain on the same position, so that it needs to consider development work at the same time with the humanitarian work to stop this vicious circle of human crisis. That is what I would like to say. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Tirana.
Very efficient. Yes.
Equally brief.
I can't answer the refugee question, so there you go. I actually don't know the answer, and I would actually challenge. I'm not a refugee expert, and so I'm not tapped into all of the networks either. So there may well be some level of conversations that are already happening. But if I understood you correctly, I think it's really about asking. It's not about collaborating for the sake of collaborating. It's really about collaborating to define first what the issue is that we want to change. What is the change we want to see? Then we look and say, it's really important, I think, then to look and say, well, is this already being done? Is there something that we can build on? We don't want to just come and recreate something for the sake just because we all are in sort of being moved by the idea of you know, mass mobilization or movements. One thing I'd say, my parting words are, movements are hard work. Mm-hmm. They're not easy. They don't come organically. The importance, I agree fully with what Rachel was saying about the importance is that you bring the different perspectives. We collaborate because each of us brings a strength, not because we're all the same, that we disagree and we evolve the conversation. And I think we have to change the way that we think about collaboration, and we need to and then we can be part of movements.
And the narrower the goal, the easier the cooperation. For example, one historical example is the international campaign to ban landmines, which was one single objective, and there you had the NGO community, states, the UN, all working together for one, working on migration issues and advocating with UNHCR and with European governments is another equally necessary but more difficult. I'd like to thank the panel for their contribution, thank the audience for being attentive and engaged, and also thank our friends online for following us. And if, presumably, if they have further questions, they can send them to the organizers and relay back to the panel. So let's give a round of applause to the panel and to ourselves.